Republicans on the Hill are hesitant or at least skeptical around LPO. Companies really felt the fire, especially post-election and leading up to the election, to get their loans finalized, to get their deals signed.
Removing a gigaton by 2030 and stuff like that. Those are the kind of expectations that really takes a hit. And it's not a surprise to anyone like in the industry that we were not going to scale anywhere close to that fast.
Hey, Richard Elvin here, back with Wicked Problems. Quick intro before we get into it, because we have a lot to get to. That was Britain's best up-and-coming band, Sun Charmer, with our theme music. And then you heard Maeve Allsup from Latitude Media, who reckon could outdraw Jigger Shaw, formerly of the LPO and the Department of Energy in the US, in a gunfight. And we'll talk about her reporting on the agonizing fast and slow, then fast and slow suicide of American energy. R&D. So that's exciting. But we lead off also with Mr. Carbon Removals himself, Robert Höglund, co-founder of the gold standard for information on carbon removals, cdr.fyi, and also a market actor at Milky Wire, amongst other things. So 2 great interviews. Also a sad note, I'm wearing the cap of my alma mater in honor of George Wendt, who also spent a bit of time at America's Catholic Harvard before heading to Chicago's Second City comedy troupe, then on to L.A., never to be seen again in South Bend, or at least for many years. Known for playing Norm in the 80s sitcom Cheers. And when I was there in Notre Dame in the late 80s, he was a bit of a legend, so R.I.P.
What's the story, Norm? Thirsty guy walks into a bar. You finish it.
And I was worried there for a sec when I spoke to someone mentioning that on this episode. I thought I might have got the dorm wrong that he was in, but it was in fact Zom. And if you know, you know. Also in the news, our old stomping ground in Qatar hosted its economic forum, where the keynote speaker was a disembodied Elon Musk, who fortunately wasn't there to be physically eviscerated by former BBC presenter, now with Bloomberg, Michelle Hussein, who more or less butchered him on live TV and on stage in Doha. Even our friends at the Bulwark noticed that particular episode in Qatar, of all places.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Miller from the Bulwark here with managing editor Sam Stein. We're talking about Elon's recent remarks to the Qatar Economic Forum. He's doing this thing where he speaks like a weird Wizard of Oz, kind of voice of God, like man in the sky kind of thing with a vague background. So he might be coming to you out of the clouds, where he issues like kind of petulant remarks and bon mots from on high. He did so to the folks gathered in Qatar. And man, I gotta say, he was prickly. He was defensive. He does not like Bill Gates. And wanted to walk through a couple of the highlights. Sam Stein suffered through the whole 40 minutes. I've just picked out a little bit.
I watched it on 2.0 speed, just to be clear.
Okay. So what was your takeaways? And then we'll get to a couple of the clips.
Well, I thought that there's a couple of things. One is you can't overstate how massive the screen was of him. Like it was not just a screen. It was like the entire auditorium is just Elon's big head. And yes, the fuzzy background made it a little bit mysterious.
Maybe we'll do an Elon thing at the Sphere in Las Vegas, where it's just like Elon's head.
That's too much. Yeah,
I
can understand it, but that's too much. There was a defensiveness to it that clearly came through. I mean, that's just from start to finish, very defensive, and sort of combative too with the interviewer.
As a former Qatar resident and somebody who actually perhaps has studied a little bit more about these things, with the link in the show notes to the piece that we wrote up earlier today about this incident, about this encounter, and you might find that to be enlightening, including the folks at the Bulwark. So I encourage you to check it out, guys. Anyway, let's get to it, and if you can, please do chip in the price of a beer for Norm, or even for the price of a Musk clone. We'll give you a discount at wickedproblems.earth, where we can promise you it'll definitely better value than the latter, if not the former. On with the show. Robert Höglund, head of CDR at Milky Wire, and the founder of, or co-founder of cdr.fyi, one of the best resources out there for tracking the progress of carbon removals. Thanks for coming back on Wicked Problems, man.
Thanks. Yeah, good to be here again.
And how are things in Bangkok?
It's good. Yeah, it's been a great time. I've been here for quite some time. Now heading back to Europe this summer, so that will be a change. But probably go to more events when I'm in Europe.
I would think that would make it slightly easier.
Mm-hmm.
But look, we're talking on the morning of the 21st of May, and lots happened since we last spoke. But certainly in the last week, there's been quite a lot of news flow involving I guess what one might call the kind of marquee brand, if that's the right way of putting it, in carbon removals, and that would be Climeworks, the Swiss company with Icelandic operations, which kind of been in the news for perhaps not great reasons, in that an Icelandic newspaper came out last week and did what can only be described as a hit piece of trying to basically say that the company hasn't even removed as much carbon as it has emitted in a given year. Followed by a new report in the Guardian about 10% of its workforce being laid off. We have kind of the same market dynamic problems that we talked about last time you were on, and that their buyers are just too few and too particular. But real headwinds, particularly in the States, where a lot of the money that was promised for tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill seem to be on the chopping block. I haven't checked what happened in the votes last night in the House, but certainly the direction of travel is that support for the industry is going to be tough. So where are we in this industry, Robert?
Well, it's several stories going on at the same time, so you need to really keep the narratives distinct. I mean, in one sense, I think we passed the peak of the hype of inflated expectations, like on the Gartner hype cycle. But at the same time, sales and deliveries of durable carbon removal is increasing and will continue to increase. So as we go down the hype cycle, like the real world goes up. So you shouldn't confuse going down the hype cycle with everything going down. It's just that these kind of large expectations and kind of headlines that people were throwing around a few years ago about removing a gigaton by 2030 and stuff like that, those are the kind of expectations that really takes a hit. And it's not a surprise to anyone like in the industry that we were not going to scale anywhere close to that fast. And it's you see one narrative in pitch decks and then another narrative like when you work directly with projects. And so the industry is, I would say, developing quite rapidly, because we have more than 500 durable CDR companies, and in direct air capture there's 140 companies. So there's a lot of approaches being tested, and there's a lot of learning going on. And that's what I think this decade should be for, like learning what are the best and most promising methods, and gaining a lot of experience and knowledge, and then we can make the kind of larger scale up. So but of course there's some disappointment from the ones that are really eager to scale up quickly, and some uncertainty for these kind of larger projects. But that's really just one part of the story, I would say. And
I think there's just been, I don't know, it's been kind of a little bit weird to watch how many people have come out to sort of gleefully declare the obituary for carbon removals generally. And it's one of these things I've never really quite understood. It's like, why is it something you wouldn't want to work? So I've never quite understood I understand the argument that like, okay, this is, right now one of the basic use cases is like enhanced oil recovery or enhanced gas recovery, and that's bad. Okay, sure. But also, why would you not want a technology that, could do a lot of good if it worked to scale or to get down the cost curve? In fact, there was a piece in Heat Map, I think, with Jack Andreessen, who formerly of Breakthrough Energy, kind of public policy advocate there, who's now an independent, writing that, we could have been writing the same things, the critiques that have come out in the last few days. You could have been writing the same things about solar and battery 20 years ago, and people did. Isn't that right?
Yeah, no, that is right. I'm not sure why there's so many that want to kind of push that message, and you see it with other technologies as well, like hydrogen. I would say is like in the bottom, like this throw disillusionment, and there's been a lot of glee around kind of hydrogen projections also being adjusted and expectations being adjusted. And with nuclear, I would say as well, a lot of people that celebrate that, look, nuclear costs are higher than we thought. I guess it's kind of I told you so mentality, that someone who was questioning maybe the technology before and feel vindicated as soon as they see a headline that seems to give them some, push behind their narrative. And well, some people are just like super locked into the solution that they prefer, like maybe 100% solar and wind, for example, and are against essentially all tech solutions. And finally, I would say that on the NGO side, people have been traditionally quite skeptical about anything that's not developed yet. So any kind of plans to abate emissions with unproven solutions, like, which is a must, because other than kind of just stopping economic activity, we need things that and new types of fuel, CCS, CDR. But they have been critical, fearing that companies and governments may kind of put their hope in future solutions, but then not actually follow through and more use it as a fig leaf, as it has been called. But that's more like, it's not about the technology, more about like how it has the potential to be used as an excuse to push things to the future.
Yeah, and I think that, but there is, I think, fairness in some of the critique, and I think Jack's piece acknowledges this, in the idea that if you take the straw man case, if you take the case that, well, these pitch decks, again, I've raised money, you've probably raised money, you've certainly seen a lot of these pitch decks. You don't go in saying that you're not really super confident and that you're not really going to make a difference and there's not going to be a market. No one's going to, that's not how you fund a company. Whether promising venture type returns is, that perhaps is something that's now come into question, but whether that was ever a good idea. But I suppose, this is not the first time in the history of technology that an entrepreneur who's super excited comes in and actually says, like, well, no, we could do that if all the things broke our way. Yeah. And so it's just kind of that. I see that Climeworks is actually, I see Freya Prade, our friend, the friend of the show in Sifted, had spoken to management at Climeworks, and they actually, they're in response to the idea they're having layoffs. They actually might go for expansion. They might, if they're going to pull back in the States because of these tax credits being pulled, or other things not going their way. Go on.
No, just a correction. The tax, nothing is being pulled yet, and 45Q credits, which are the tax credits, are likely to remain. What's perhaps possible that it goes away is this DAC hub support, which is essentially matching funding for capex for DAC deployments. Right. Well, but we don't know if that's going to go away either. But that's what's been kind of in leaks. It was, I think, on some leak, it was on the shopping board. Yeah.
100%. And so thank you for the clarification. But I think, it's there's so many things happening in the middle of the night in Washington at the moment that it's hard to know. We're going to be speaking with Maeve Allsup from Latitude later today, who's been keeping a close eye on this stuff to try and kind of cut through, to understand where the state of play is. So keep an eye out for that. But look, I mean, I guess one of the reasons you were posting earlier this week about the hype cycle, right? So let's just remind ourselves, the Gartner hype cycle is, this classic way of seeing how technology, people get super excited and people make, really, first there's skepticism, then they're like, get over the skepticism. And then everyone wants to say like, oh, so this is the best thing since sliced bread. It's going to fix everything. And then, that weirdly enough, no, it doesn't live up to that unrealistic level of expectations, and then we go into this trough, and I think you were referring to it as disillusionment. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called that, right? Correct. And then it's a slope on enlightenment and the plateau of productivity.
Right. And again, this is as night follows day, right? This is just as predictable as this is just what happens. And you put out a paper, again, I know you didn't write it, but you were certainly helping to amplify it, like post the peak in the hype cycle. How do you actually look at a market? It's like, what were some of the takeaways that again, people should definitely check out our show notes and they can get the paper. We'll link to it. But, in terms of like, what were some of the main points there about how to think about this market going forward?
Yeah, so that paper was from Carbon Gap, which I also collaborate with and write some papers for. But actually by Julia Gonsalves, who used to work at Climeworks. So it's called CDR Beyond the Hype Cycle, or giving kind of it was published last year, where expecting what was gonna happen, and giving some a lot of the concrete advice for like how a productive way for going forward for the CDR sectors, and some of the things that stood out to me, like, was that you need to manage expectations, as we were talking about, like being clear about how much we think is going to be removed, and that it's going to be relatively slow. And even in 10, 15 years from now, CDR is a small part of the climate solution. Like, it's by no means it's like a saver or like a main character. Like, we play a really important supporting role, but yeah, we should be clear about those expectations. And one suggestion as well in the report is to see CDR as a public utility rather than a commodity.
Right.
So even though voluntary buyers play an outsized important role now in testing things out and getting this started and de-risked them, like even done in the real world, of course the public utility part is more what carries the day later on, either if it's paid by states directly or if it's in ETS systems, etc. And then also to prioritize like pushing the technology forward, and advancing TRL, dropping costs. And I think that's really important. I think it's going to be hard to just get costs down through scale, like building these large scale facilities and bring the cost down through that. Like, we don't have the demand for that, so we have to be smarter about bringing costs down, more bringing costs down in the lab than through just scaling, I would say.
And I think that's the interesting thing about the hub, kind of concept in the States, and maybe that was, again, that's when people come at them for that's a misallocation of resources. Time will tell, I guess.
Out. Very little is paid out. Yeah. So there has been no allocation.
No, 100%. Well, understood. But I guess in terms of the critique about it would be an misallocation if they were to go ahead, given that like there might be other ways to scale, to figure that out rather than just scaling to kind of test. But I guess you come back to the fundamental thing that hasn't really changed, right? And everyone's known about this the whole time, which is it's a public good. It's diffuse in how it's distributed, and who pays for it and who gets the benefit of it is a difficult problem to get your head around. And the public policy environment just doesn't seem like it's going to be favorable to changing that in the near future. But the math hasn't changed, right? Like, insofar as, UK is one of the few places that has this net zero statute on the books, but in terms of the framework, it's like either you're going to walk away from the thinking about how you either stay under 1.5, which seems unlikely, or you stay under 2, which seems difficult. But even having any chance of doing that, or even figure out, like, other than waiting for trees to grow, what is your plan? No one else seems to have the critics don't seem to have a plan. Like, what is your alternative? And planting trees doesn't seem like it's sufficient. I just kind of wave it off as like, well, it'll be sorted itself out. Okay, how? When? I don't know. Is that something that am I alone in just being annoyed about this kind of like lack of like recognition that if you don't have an answer to how you're going to do this, how you're going to either address historic emissions that are up there, or how you're going to meet that gap, it's like, exactly. Are you just okay with it? I mean,
it seems like it's some unwillingness to discuss future solutions and make plans rather than like put all focus on just today. Like, of course, we need to mostly focus on reducing emissions now, but we still need to plan ahead at the same time. The solutions take decades to develop, so otherwise you're just going to stand there with hard to abate sectors that we can't do much about.
Right. And it is I just think it's shocking that we're now so deep into this now. It's 2025. We're halfway to some of the goals that people that the world set itself. And the idea that anyone would be cheering that any particular solution set is hitting its expected set of challenges in the hype cycle is just, I don't know, it's disheartening. But I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you about, Robert, is what are you seeing with your different hats on in terms of the market itself? You mentioned we're seeing a lot more. You're seeing a lot more orders. across the different tech stacks for, kind of durable CDR contract removal. What can you tell us about how that's evolved, given, the top level mood music isn't great. But yet, you're seeing some other stuff, with your kind of market observer hat on that perhaps most people are not paying attention to if they're just following the headlines.
Right. So there's several streams like cdr.fyi. We track all the orders of cover removal and the deliveries and data on everything that goes on the durable cover removal market. And as such, we see how things come in, and it is continuing to grow. Microsoft is extremely dominant. Like they're the one that buys most CDR, and I would say that they're the only big company that does what it would take to reach net zero by 2030, or like an early net zero target. Of course, they will continue to try to reduce their emissions, but they have a lot of AI and so on that increases it. But if a big company were to reach a near-term net zero target, they would have to buy a lot. And I think we should applaud those that do something, because they're not required to, and actually very few do support external climate solutions. And we really don't see that as instead of emission reductions, because it's really expensive. They're spending billions of dollars on. I would think that they rather save the money if they could just reduce their emissions and not have to buy CDR. So, but even if we take away Microsoft, the values are increasing, both the total orders, and there's new buyers coming in all the time. It's not like a wave of buyers, but it's a steady trickle. So you do see more and more companies realizing that they're going to have to engage. So is that trickle enough to maintain this whole ecosystem of startups? Like, probably not, but it's still a steady increase. And I want to say some things on the policy side as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think it's you shouldn't be too depressed about the US, I think, and that's not the only game in town, right? Like, so for example, Canada has tax credits for carbon removal, direct air capture, and CCS. That's even bigger than the DACOBs. Like, they pay 60% of the capex, and the DACOBs were cost matching up to, I think, 50%. Like, so you could get as much as you raised up to the amount we are awarded, if I'm not mistaken, whereas Canada can pay up to 60% of the actual capex. So that's actually more generous in my understanding. And then you have things like the EU is today having a workshop on a procurement program for the EU. So, and the pre-read mentions like several billion euros in support for procuring CDR by the EU. And I think it's really important that it's actually extra money that gets paid out, and then that is not dependent on voluntary buyers matching it to be paid out, because most support is only carrots. Like, it depends. You still need a buyer to activate the support. So I think it's really important that EU also buys outright themselves to kind of a wide portfolio to help build a EU carbon removal sector that can deliver on the union's target. So that's some positive developments also on the policy side.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you raised that. I wonder if I haven't been following the EU internal debate closely enough, but I have seen reporting over the last couple of weeks that the Spanish government has reallocated some of its defense budget, for example, to doing kind of resilience and adaptation work post Valencia floods, and there was some talk in Germany about the new government led by Merz saying similar things, that if they're going to actually break their previous hostility to rate, actually, because they're an extremely under-leveraged country compared to most of the Western world in terms of their debt to GDP ratio, that if they were to alter their policy and consider some climate measures to be in the defense realm, that would give an opening about how to free up public money that previously would have been unthinkable. I don't know. Is that something that's on your radar at all? Like, considering this to be a defense issue, and therefore that helps to free up some reframe the thinking?
That's interesting. I can't say I've thought about that, but it's certainly an interesting way, especially on the adaptation side and risk mitigation and avoidance. Yeah.
And then finally, you had posted last night a fascinating thing. You mentioned Microsoft. Actually, before I ask you this, are there any sectors other than big techs of Microsoft, aviation, you see other buyers coming in? Is there any pattern? Is there any kind of new sector? Because I suppose one of the things that people were expecting is that, other than Oxy, I was rereading, Andreas Malm's and Wim Karten's Overshoot last night, and I know that, well, little birdie tells me that so one of them anyway is really surprised, that things have kind of gone the way they have, and there hasn't been more flag waving from oil and gas about this, or indeed putting some of those profits into, helping to prop up or helping to scale some of the carbon removal actors. And I'm certainly not from cdr.fyi data, not seeing a lot of movement in that direction. No. Are there any sectors that people are coming in from?
In the oil and gas sector, Equinor is the only significant purchaser that we know of. And Oxy is a product developer rather than a purchaser themselves, but they may use tons for their own purposes. And airlines you mentioned, there's a few shipping companies, two in Japan that started to engage, and that's a sector that may probably going to use some CDR as well. Both aviation and shipping would rely to some extent on electrofuels, and those are extremely energy intensive, and CDR may be the cheaper option for both of them to some extent. So there's a natural demand there. So we see that. But yeah, other than that, it's mostly kind of higher profit margin, software, insurance, consulting, data center, that kind of IT. So.
And you posted something from, is it Fast Markets? That kind of gave a ratio of, essentially if you were to put a certain percentage of profits against this, that there are, not that many companies that are in a position to do this, but that might change over time. Just if you could remind me about a little bit of that.
So that's an interesting analysis. I think they mentioned the paper that I wrote together with Eli Mitchell-Larson at Carbon Gap in 2022 and then updated a year after, which does they're extrapolating on that analysis with many more companies and expanding on analysis. It was great to see, but essentially looking at if you cap your purchases of carbon removal at 1% of profit, which is arbitrary, but it still is a way of comparing and what may be acceptable for companies to pay for voluntary action. Then they saw that today 1 in 90 companies of this big data set would afford a Microsoft style portfolio, with the same relative amount of purchases if they used 1% of profits. But by 2050, that would be 1 in 8. So as economy grows, as companies have reduced their emissions, which they will do. And I think we previously argued in this Carbon Gap paper that essentially all sectors will afford to buy 10% of their emissions with durable carbon removal. It's not going to be a blocker for anyone. So you shouldn't stare, no one is suggesting that you have to buy 100% right now. If you can, that's great. Go ahead. Reach net zero with permanent carbon removal right now. I think that we should encourage those who want to do that, maybe smaller companies with really high profit per ton. But other than that, planning to just reach a small subset of your scope 1, 2, and 3 with CDR is going to be affordable for most. But yeah, it is a sobering analysis still, because the emissions are highly unequally distributed, and the big emitters are the ones that are least likely to do something voluntary. And that ties into the whole SBTI debate, because most hard to abate emitters that have big scope 1 emissions are not even in the SBTI. So that's why you have to get the SBTI companies to include scope 3 when they're planning for removal, for example, because otherwise those emissions are just not covered.
Well, Robert Höglund, anything you want to add before we let you go? Appreciate your time today.
Yeah, I mean, there's always more to add, but I think we're good like this.
Okay. All right. Well, Robert Höglund, head of CDR at Milky Wire and co-founder of cdr.fyi, amongst many other hats. Thanks so much for coming back on the show, man.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
You too. My thanks to Robert Höglund for coming on the show and trying to explain where we are right now in that market for carbon removals. And coming up next is our conversation with Maeve Allsup, returning to the show from Latitude Media to talk about, because if the carbon removals market wasn't enough carnage for you, well, wait till you hear about what's happening in Washington. Freeze for a second, the old school Hollywood way, waiting for it to get speed, as they say. There we go. Maeve Allsup, founding reporter, Latitude Media, and podcast champion on Open Circuit. welcome back to Wicked Problems. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be back.
And gosh, it's been a while since we spoke, but yeah, a few things have happened. A few things have happened on your beat. And I should explain, I'm wearing a lid because, in honor of also just my fellow domer, George Wendt, R.I.P., because he spent 2 years, by the way, in I think it was Zom, but one of them with dorm was like 2 dorms away from where I stayed, and
Wow.
he went out to drive to L.A. for like the summer and never came back to school. So, but long and much missed George Wendt. There you go. So anyway, we are talking on Wednesday, the 21st of May. You have been covering Capitol Hill, the Department of Energy, all the things that are going on in the new wonderful world of Washington, despite you being on the West Coast. But you're where the action is because you're where all the smart people are. So let's start with the good news, right? So the relatively good news, which is you did a piece back a couple weeks ago now where you were looking at investments in kind of clean tech, climate tech in the Q1, where it's it's maybe not as bad as we thought. So maybe let's start there. So am I wrong? If the sky didn't actually fall in Q1 just yet. Is that right?
Yeah, some of the early Q1 data that we have seen showed a more optimistic outline, at least when it comes to domestic manufacturing. And I think folks that I talked to described this as we were really seeing the impact of some of these IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, tax incentives as things were starting to get built. Projects that had long been announced were finally starting to put steel in the ground in Q1. Even in those very early days of the second Trump administration. I will caveat that, though. I'm sure folks are eagerly watching the kind of U.S. tariff chaos unfold as closely as we are here. But those went into effect in early April. So that initial positive data doesn't include some of that uncertainty. And I will say that uncertainty is sort of the name of the game right now. And so that is having a little bit of a chilling effect as tariffs come and go and change, as folks just are kind of waiting for the dust to settle, is what I hear a lot.
Right. And again, you were pointing some data from the Rhodium Group and Clean Investment Monitor. And I think one of the things you're also pointing to is that even though it was up, or rather it was, positive quarter on quarter, year on year was a bit down, which is not completely surprising given, the election outcome and what expectations were. So pre-Liberation Day, etc. But one of the things that seems like in the data that you're citing from Rhodium Group and Clean Investment Monitor was that a lot of cancellations of clean manufacturing investments, and it seems, if I'm looking at the data correctly from the chart in your piece, it's primarily in batteries. So anything you can shed on that, because that seems like something that might be particularly affected, in the critical mineral space by kind of tariffs that might have come into effect, then off, then on, then off, then on, then off, then on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, this Rhodium Group data doesn't take the tariffs into account, but I will say anecdotally, there's been a bit of upheaval in the battery sector globally. I'm sure people were kind of paying attention to the Northvolt news, and the goings on both in their activities here and in Europe. And that's just one example, but maybe we'll chat about this a little bit more later. But there are also several domestic battery makers that are tweaking their manufacturing plans, not just due to tariff uncertainty, but I think there's also some anxiety around IRA credits and, of course, federal funding uncertainty as well.
Right.
That's the word I will repeat a million times in this episode, Richard, is uncertainty. How many times can I get it in?
I think that we can take it as read, Maeve, and I think again it's if either of us could predict it, then despite whatever rules might be existing for either of us ethically, that I'm sure we could probably retire off the knowledge of exactly what was going to happen. But never mind that. But look, so mixed picture, right? So it's not all bad in Q1, perhaps a little bit surprising in the sense that maybe you would have expected people to pull the plug more in an anticipatory behavior, expecting things to go maybe sideways. I guess there's a lot of talk, and I, like in my small way, contributed to this, of like thinking, like looking at all the Republican districts in the U.S. and thinking like, oh well, the IRA and incentives, they're like they disproportionately 80-20, kind of go for benefit Republican districts, and so surely they're not going to cut their own throats. And now we come to Congress. So you've also been following this big beautiful bill getting marked up in the House before it goes to the Senate. Where you've got a couple pieces on this. And again, it's such a fluid situation. But I think I read, or rather, I listened to Robinson Meyer from a rival publication interviewing someone live when the kind of markup of the bill dropped, and like going through all the things in the IRA, and they're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Because there was some expectation that like things like geothermal might be kind of spared, or DAC hubs, or hydrogen, or something. And like your reporting indicates that that's perhaps that optimism was misplaced. So what's the state of play?
Yeah, I think you're right that the statistic around where most IRA investment was made geographically in the country, being in red states, being in red districts, and on top of that, and this is slightly distinct from the tax bill conversation, but a lot of funding that was doled out by the Department of Energy, funding that was appropriated through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Some of those largest investments, the DAC hubs you noted, are also in Republican districts. So I think that was sort of a self-soothing tactic for folks in clean energy, right? For the last 6-8 months, even going back before the election, there was this sense that no matter what happens, these projects are safe, they have support. There is no way that Republicans in Congress would want to,
kill tens of thousands of jobs.
Exactly. And there was also kind of the scalpel, not a sledgehammer phrase going around. And so I think partly because of that, this initial early draft out of the House did take a lot of people by surprise. There were the things that everybody expected, right? EV tax credits, some of the residential credits. One big surprise that I'm sure a lot of folks are paying attention to is nuclear.
Yeah.
A tax credit that people thought would be really safe. There's been a lot of activity around nuclear, particularly in the US. The hyperscalers are really invested in nuclear. It's really been at the center of our conversations around how to power data centers. But again, at least in this early draft, and we don't know what things will ultimately look like. Probably by the time this episode drops, things will have changed. Right. Because as we were discussing beforehand at 1 a.m. Eastern this morning, folks were back in the House discussing this. So things are changing all the time. But yeah, nuclear is one that I will be watching really, really closely to see, do they continue with this draft that phases the credit out early? Or does the very strong coalition of hyperscalers and others come together to push to maintain it?
Well, that will certainly be interesting. I mean, the other thing I was surprised, again, I'm even hearing during Chris Wright's confirmation hearing, Mike Lee from Utah, the chairman of the Energy Committee in the Senate, kind of, again, as a I guess you could say, like advanced geothermal, right? It was meant to be this bipartisan thing of like, it was even like kind of underweight in the IRA, and people were like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we address that? Because everyone loves that. And hey, Chris Wright used to be an investor in Fervo, one of the most successful startups, in the advanced geothermal space, using fracking technology to be able to kind of like unlock, previously untapped hot rocks, if that's the best way of putting it. But it, had Republican support, right? Like, who doesn't like this? Everyone likes this. And yet even that seemed to not get a lot of love based on, what we're seeing so far. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think, there's a range of trouble for some of these tax credits and geothermal, again, because we assumed that it was safe and had support from Chris Wright and his allies. But again, in this first draft that we saw, they're looking to phase that credit out early. And I think something that is really important for something like geothermal and nuclear, these, and at least in the case of advanced nuclear and advanced geothermal, these are projects that are not yet in the ground, right? We have lots of announced projects, but these are not projects that likely would actually benefit from the tax credit if they're phased out 3 years early
Right.
or 5 years early. So even though that might feel like a small change, just phasing out the credit early, it's actually a big deal. And there are also some credits where the credit itself is being framed as applicable, or sorry, the timelines themselves are being phased from steel in the ground to when they come online, which for many of these projects is another several years further out. They take a long time to fund, they take a long time to build. So that timeline shift could be a really big issue that means a lot of these projects that were counting on the tax credits ultimately don't qualify.
Right. Were there any winners? Were there anybody that like was expected to either not get hit or were expected to get hit and actually did not have as much so far as we know? Or maybe another way of thinking about that, because again, it's like who cares what happened last night because it'll change in 2 hours, right? So like you've been talking to your sources across public and private sector, market watchers. What are they looking for in the signs over the coming days and weeks? There was some idea about getting something out by Memorial Day. That seems unlikely, but who knows? If they work all night every night for the next 3 nights, maybe something clears the house. But what are people watching? Where expectations kind of like modulating at the moment based on completely anecdotal, subjective, conversations you're having with sources.
Yeah, and I will say I'm not a congressional reporter, of course. So
understood.
Your guess is as good as mine on whether things are wrapped up and sent off to the Senate by Memorial Day. I really don't know. I will say one credit where there seemed to be a bit of a bright spot was the 45Z credit for clean fuels, which was actually extended, again, in this initial draft, extended for a couple of extra years. And another surprising one, I did a piece a couple of weeks ago where I was talking to a source who said 45Q, the carbon capture credit, is sort of the canary in the coal mine as far as how far Congress might go. If 45Q fares very well, great, maybe there's more hope than expected for the rest of the credits. If 45Q gets trimmed back, maybe we were being overly optimistic. Ultimately, I think 45Q, it was not extended and it did have some restrictions placed on it in this initial draft. So kind of a mixed bag on the canary in the coal mine metaphor. Right. I can't say definitively either way on that one yet.
But yeah, so 45Q isn't cooked yet one way or the other. So Robert Höglund, who I will also appear in this episode, I speaking to him this morning, he corrected me because he was like, because we were talking about Climeworks, right, which seems to be, if not collateral damage, then certainly adjacency impacted by the uncertainty in Washington, certainly over the DAC hub kind of funding that was extended under the bipartisan infrastructure law, where that was meant to support these research hubs on direct air capture. Climeworks had bet big on that in terms of facilities, that it was a facility that was helping to build in the States. It seems to have moderated his expectations based on some of that, various other factors as well. But it appears that hub part is gone, but 45Q remains kind of in play. So I suppose that's the interesting bit. It's going to be interesting for that industry.
Yeah, and the hubs are another point of uncertainty. Again, like everything is changing in the big beautiful bill by the hour, and also at the Department of Energy, right? Because a lot of these projects had signed deals. So the DAC hubs are managed by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is certainly under fire from the DOGE downsizing efforts at the Department of Energy. But when we saw the initial sort of quote unquote hit list of projects go around, both of the DAC hubs were on that list. And I've got a piece that talks specifically about the Project Cypress, which is the DAC hub that Climeworks and Heirloom are working on. And in that piece, I dig into this massive behind-the-scenes lobbying effort after that hit list came out. And in a second draft of that list that I saw, Project Cypress was no longer on it. So again, I don't think anybody feels safe. Right. I don't think any of these projects are feeling that they have a 100% chance of going forward. But I know there is massive work happening, and I can't comment specifically on Climeworks, but massive work happening to try to shore up these projects.
Yeah. Well, it feels like a great time to be investing. Like, like particularly if you think you have a contract, and you think you have a deal with the federal government and you don't. And that leads me to our third topic, which is the department, right? The Department of Energy. Like I had to apologize to listeners and readers because I covered the Chris Wright confirmation hearings. Again, I'm over here in the UK. I'm not a congressional reporter either, but certainly as somebody who has been around for a while, I've seen a good few confirmation hearings over the years, and it did seem to me that Chris Wright seemed sane compared to the baseline of Trump nominees. And I think that gave a lot of people hope of like, okay, he seems like he's not insane and crazy, and he's got business experience. And yes, okay, it was a kind of wildcat, fracking organization, but also he's an investor, worked in nuclear, he, worked in solar, invested in geothermal. So a guy who actually seems like he should be taken seriously.
And has the relevant requisite experience. Yeah.
Which would be nice. And again, it was a hit against the previous energy secretary, right? That she was a politician without having a lot of industry experience. So there were, people I talked to, my sources were like, actually, this could be great.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot of optimism.
And things have turned out slightly differently. You're reporting going back to the beginning of May, and like, again, you're fantastic going toe-to-toe with Jigger Shah on Open Circuit, rival podcast, peer podcast, let's say. We're just a very small peer. But anyway, you guys had a great conversation explaining something that I had not put together before seeing your reporting and then hearing the conversation about that there is this self-sustaining dynamic with talent. Right, it's not just DOE, but DOE is where you're covering, and Jigger, which seems to be happening. And Jigger Shaw, just to remind our listeners, used to head up the Loan Programs Office, which we'll come to in a minute, in the department. But can you just give a sense of what is going on from your sources, your reporting in the department? Again, we're 21 days after that piece dropped, so things have, if anything, accelerated since then. But give us your sense.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental kind of the lay of the land at DOE is that there have been months of chaos. There was sort of this limbo right after the inauguration when, career staff, who many have worked at the agency for decades, some their entire careers, some recent college grads, right, who had been in their roles for less than a year. But that there was, even though folks knew change was coming, nobody ever expected that the Biden to Trump, the Granholm to Wright transition would come with no bumps. There was that sort of limbo period until DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, headed up by Elon Musk, made its way into the Department of Energy. And since then, we have seen several rounds of mass resignations via the folks may have heard about the deferred resignation offer, which essentially
so the fork in the road email, right? So like basically saying
fork in the road email, the notorious email, right? So folks could leave voluntarily, stay on the payroll until September. I think over 1,000 staffers took that in the first phase. They reopened it, and another 2,500 or so took it. So we have just seen mass departures, and on my side, kind of anecdotally, right, all of these sources that I had built up at the agency over several months, a lot of folks left. There was a Friday in April when all of a sudden I got a lot of messages saying, hey, I decided to take this. Today's my last day. My office is no longer functioning. All of my managers are gone, and I thought I would get laid off anyway.
And that's the self-sustaining dynamic, right? So like people who, first came in thinking like, okay, we'll see what happens, right? Maybe we'll shift emphasis, right? But like, I'll still have work, right? It'll still be worth doing because, the country needs this stuff, right? And so I'm a civil servant. I'm probably making less than I could make in the private sector, theoretically. So, you're not doing this because, for kind of glory anywhere, fame anyway, or riches. So But then you see your colleagues, start to go, and then you see your manager go, and then you see that there's no one to learn from, and then you see that basically there's no one, even a sufficient amount of people to staff the projects that are actually going on already. And so at some point you're like, well, why am I going to be the mug who sits here and has to work till 3 a.m. every night just to keep the lights on? Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. And, there is uncertainty. You mentioned this optimism around Chris Wright. People aren't sure, one, what Chris Wright thinks about any of this, and two, how much sway or say Chris Wright has. I was at a conference in DC earlier this year for ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, and they had a record turnout at this event, even though a few weeks prior, I wasn't sure if it was going to happen. I didn't have a ticket until 2 weeks before because I thought maybe they won't be hosting this conference, mostly focused on the clean energy projects that they've been working on. Record turnout because people wanted to hear what Chris Wright had to say. And on stage, he struck a really optimistic tone. People were surprised. People were pleased for the most part with the tone that he struck about the research efforts. And then you hear him, he was on the Hill a couple of weeks ago testifying about the national labs, doing more with less. So he has this sort of, at least publicly, a little bit of a back and forth that I find hard to keep track of. And I think folks within the Department of Energy also just aren't sure. And nobody can provide the exact assurance that you will have a job the next day. And that is definitely concerning too, whether it's early career employees or even folks who worked through the Bush administrations, through the Obama administrations, and have been through this turnover before. This has been distinctly different because of that uncertainty.
Yeah. And maybe they got their 20 and they're going to get a pension. So like basically, it's kind of like, do I leave now or do I wait to like suffer through, the indignity of having some 26-year-old tell me to go F off? And no disrespect to 26-year-olds, Maeve, I have no idea how old you are, but you're definitely
older than that.
Okay. Well, there you go. You're looking great on it. Whatever. But look, the main thing is, so that's happened, right? Capacity reductions are happening. Like they're happening at, it seems like an uncontrollable, or perhaps uncontrolled descent, or what is it? What's the SpaceX term? It's the unplanned disassembly. Radical, sudden whatever it is. Anyway, point being, rocket blows up, and they have a term for it, but it's not blowing up. It's rapid disassembly. We're seeing rapid disassembly. Again, it's across the federal government, right? The expertise, the technocratic layer. Your reporting is showing how that's documenting, what's happening in DOE, but it's across the board. And of course, it's not just, again, like that's really bad, it seems like, for the future, about like you're kind of getting rid of your seed corn, your younger people, your more experienced people, your middle management, like there's not a lot left, people getting grants. And then you have been doing some reporting in this the last couple of days on the Loan Programs Office, where your colleague Jake Shaw used to run. So again, it must be a bit weird. You're quoting, a guy who's sort of a semi-colleague. Again, I don't know the employment status or whatever, but like basically, it's kind of an interesting beat to have to be on. But what's happening with the LPO? The LPO, just to be clear for the listener, the watcher, the viewer, the LPO, the Loan Programs Office, has been around since this Bush 2 administration, right? And under Obama, it gave a $410 million loan to Tesla, which actually allowed Tesla to survive and create its first real manufacturing base in Fremont. And has become, under Biden, became so much more important under the IRA. Huge amount of money. And you could hear some slight whisperings during the Wright and the Burgum confirmations, and Zeldin. They're like, "Oh, we're going to take a look at this because so much money went out the door in a hurry after the election that we're going to be looking at some of this stuff." And now the LPO itself looks like it's had management changes. It's got all sorts of things going on. What's going on over there? It's such an important agency it's become in the last few years. Certainly kept Tesla alive. What's going to happen to it?
There, yes. So I think to back up a little bit, it's important for folks who may be listening from outside the U.S.
Sure.
LPO has been a bit of a political flashpoint for quite a while.
Right.
So it's not new that Republicans on the Hill are hesitant or at least skeptical around LPO. And Project 2025, which was a conservative sort of blueprint for a potential second Trump administration in the Department of Energy chapter, specifically calls for eliminating LPO. And so this is not new. This focus on LPO is not new. And to your point, at the end, post-election, at the end of the Biden administration, LPO had a massive pipeline of companies who had applied, who were going through this really intense due diligence process. And it is a long and slow process. And for many of these companies, it's an expensive process. They've got to have their own legal teams. And my understanding from talking to both those companies and folks within the administration at that time was that companies really felt the fire, especially post-election and leading up to the election, to get their loans finalized, to get their deals signed, because they, like others, were worried about what might happen in the early days of a new administration. So did a lot of money go out the door? No. Deals, the loans are dispersed over time. Every disbursement has to come with companies showing, again, a lot of due diligence. So it's yes, it did become kind of a flashpoint and a talking point. But I would say the key thing to understand is that they had such a strong pipeline of projects applying for funding that did speed up in the final days of the administration. It has continued to be at the center of debate, in part because some of the loans that it gives out are really massive. And so when folks in Congress are looking to cut spending, that's an easy first place to look.
Right. So the total loan authority for LPO, it was was it 400 billion? It was like
$400 billion.
It's just, that is a big number, even in Washington standards. So
and a lot of it is left. They didn't obligate. Yeah. I think the majority of it.
I think that's my understanding as well. And also that there was, again, forgive me, we didn't prep to talk about this, but if I recall, wasn't there a sum of money that was transferred to Citibank waiting for disbursement that they try to claw back as part of some of the loans that were actually issued, or that might be a different program that I'm thinking of?
Yes, you're thinking that was not the loan program's office.
Okay.
But yes, I did have it.
Okay. But the LPO, and just to be clear, the LPO is not a grant making organization, right? The LPO in its loan history, if I recall correctly, has actually been a net contributor to the Treasury, right? Essentially the interest and the payback on the loans. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but certainly over the lifetime of the program has been, if I remember hearing Jigger, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I really encourage folks to go and listen to Jigger talk about this on an open circuit, of course, plug for our podcast, but he has spoken really widely about this. Yeah. But yes, the idea of the loan programs office is that it is providing a loan obligation for projects so that those projects can go out and get private funding.
Right.
To reach their total. So at no point is the loan programs office kind of backing up 100% of a project, and Jigger will explain this much more eloquently than I can. But yeah, the idea is to kind of crowd in private funding. And so that the federal government as a co-investor, a co-backer in a project is providing that confidence to other investors for first of a kind, massive billion-dollar projects to get built here. We're looking at nuclear. We're looking at Tesla, a great example. And
importantly, this is debt, right? This isn't grant. This isn't I'm going to cut you a check and say, you seem very nice. Let me pat you on the head and give you some money. And now do some nice things in the world. It's we're going to get our money back, at a market interest rate. And only if
Tesla paid their loan back several years early, if I remember correctly. Yep.
Right. So So my point is this was a market-based incentive or initiative rather. This was, so it's kind of that's why I just find it just baffling. Why would you not want to make money, by supporting things that have a track record that do that? But, that's not there for you or me to answer, I guess. Well, look, Maeve, Allsup, we could go on. I've kept you longer than I asked for. Thank you for your patience. I'm sure I'm keeping you for more important reporting duty. Thank you so much for joining us again on Wicked Problems.
Yeah, so happy to be here anytime, Richard. Great to chat with you.
And we'll put your links to some of your recent stories in the show notes. Of course on Blue Sky, you're pretty active there, and LinkedIn. So anything else that you want to plug? Anything coming up that people should be keeping their eyes out that you're involved in?
Great question. Latitude Media is hosting our own conference. It's called Transition AI, and that's this summer in Boston. So folks can check that out if you're in the Boston area. June 12th. Thanks. Perfect. Great marketing. We'll hire you. So that is coming up in Boston, and I'm excited to listen to your chat with Robert as well. I'm heading to Iceland in a couple of weeks to do a little bit of CDR reporting, and looking forward to hearing his take before I head out there.
100%. Well, listen, Maeve, thanks again, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, Richard.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? All those nights when you've got no lights, the check is in the mail, and your little angel hung the cat up by its tail, and your third fiancé didn't show. Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You wanna be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You wanna be where everybody knows your name. Roll out of bed, Mr. Coffee's dead. The morning's looking bright. And your shrink ran off to Europe and didn't even write.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Afternoon, everybody. Norm! How you doing, Norm? What do you know? Not enough. Afternoon, everybody. Norm!
Norman?
Do you know?
I heard of that stuff. Better give me a tall one in case I like it. Afternoon, everybody. Hey!
Norman?
How you doing, Norm?
Cut the small talk and give me a beer. Afternoon, everybody. Hey, Norm! Give me a beer with you.
How's life treating you, Norm?
I just ran over its dog. Afternoon, everybody.
Oh!
Norman?
Gentlemen, start your taps. Afternoon, everybody.
Oh, Norm! How's life treating you, Norm?
He caught me in bed with his wife. Afternoon, everybody.
Oh, Norm!
Norman?
How's life, Norm?
Not for the squeamish, Coach. Afternoon, everybody. Hey,
Norm! How's it going, Norm?
Daddy's rich and Mama good looking. Afternoon, everybody.
Oh, Norm!
Norman?
What's up, Norm? My nipples. It's freezing out there. Afternoon, everybody.
Hey!
Norman?
What's the story, Norm?
Thirsty guy walks into a bar. You finish it. Afternoon, everybody.
Norm!
Norman?
What you up to, Norm? My ears. Evening, everybody.
Norman?
What's new, Norm? Most of my wife. Evening, everybody.
Norman?
Beer, Norm?
Nah, I'd probably just drink it. Afternoon, everybody.
Norman?
What's doing, Norm?
Well, science is seeking a cure for thirst. I happen to be the guinea pig. Evening, everybody.
Here, Norm?
That's that sudsy amber stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been hearing good things about it. Afternoon, everybody.
What can I do for you, Norm?
Well, I am going to need something to kill time before my second beer. How about a first one?
You got it.
Howdy, sports fans.
What'll it be, Norm?
Fame, fortune, fast women.
Yeah? How about a beer?
Even better. Afternoon, everybody.
How you doing, Norm?
Coach, I'm on top of the world, which is a dismal spot in Greenland somewhere.